you. I see that we have a lot of people dialed in, which is hopefully a testament to an exciting topic. And the topic is very, very close to my heart in many respects, because I've been living and working in English for the past 30 years or so. And when I say English, English really stands not just for the language, but for a whole host of cultural norms and nuances that create substantive challenges for people that are not native to it. And this is why this topic is so important, because in many organizations, especially global organizations, it is actually a dimension of diversity that doesn't get enough attention. And given that a lot of the workforces are non-native, and or that a lot of the workforces in global organizations don't reside in English-speaking environments, this couldn't be a more important topic. So language, culture, leadership, equitably engaging non-native English speakers. And here is Vince, who is really one of the leading experts in this area. Thank you for joining us, Vince, today.
Thank you, Jorg, and thank you so much to your team as well for setting all of this up, and how exciting it is to see so many folks coming into the session, and I see friends and clients, and I appreciate you coming. So what is up with English? And why do we even really need to have this discussion? If you think about it, the solution is easy. You don't speak English well enough, go get better at it. In fact, we'll sponsor you, we'll pay money for you to get better at it. And really the purpose of our conversation today is sort of to reframe that discussion. And, you know, where are we today in terms of what it means to work in English? Where do we want to go? And perhaps how do we bridge some of those gaps? And during this conversation, really, we're going to be discussing the journey of international professionals and what it means to reinvent yourself in another language, in another culture, all at the same time trying to maintain yourself on a leadership track. And I might add, in our definition of international professionals, that includes native speakers of English as well. And I think that's an important distinction. So let's go ahead and start taking a look at some statistics, which, you know, some people will be startled by these. Other people already know it. It's harder to come across stats that tell us how many people are working in English together with non-native speakers. But, you know, as Jorg and I talked about in our pre-meeting, it's probably a very similar ratio. In the companies that we represent, there's just an enormous number of people working in English as a non-native language. So let's set a little context first. First of all, we have quite a number of non-native speakers of English working in English with other non-native speakers. And what I call this is kind of the rise of global English. And by no means do I think that's a new language. It's still English. But what's happening is it's changing. It's evolving. It's exploding. New phrases are coming up. Old phrases are dropping out. And so perhaps that is a redefinition of what we mean by speaking in correct English. And I'll share something with you a few years ago that kind of took me by complete surprise. And not all of them, but many non-native speakers will tell you that it's easier to understand other non-native speakers easier than it is to work with native speakers of English, which for me sounded so counterintuitive. But if you think about it, all languages are coded. And in that codification, we have phrases and expressions that we use and understand each other immediately. Let me give you an example. So in English grammar, there's no way that you can put two positives together to make a negative. It doesn't work. And then somebody says, yeah, right. And all of a sudden, all the native speakers understand that immediately. yeah, right, actually is a correction. And there's something negative about that. The non-native speakers have a hard time catching that codification. The second area that will, really occupy our time in our conversation today, the non-native speakers working with the native speakers. And in Lead in English, our motto is, it takes two to tango. And that helped frame the book that Jorg, Stefan, and I wrote a few years ago. And part of that is that there's an expectation that all of the responsibility falls on the non-native speakers to get it right. And perhaps what we're talking about now is actually bringing in the native speakers to start taking that responsibility. And I'll share with you another example. Working with a woman who'd been living in the United States for 10 years, from China, a high potential in a leadership position. And I explained to her that, really now it's kind of a shared responsibility. And she said, Vince, that sounds great, but that's not how I'm being evaluated. That's not really going to help me at all. I need to create the polish, and the term she used, I need to create an executive presence. And if you just think about that for a second, as this journey in another language, in another culture, in the quest of a leadership position, that creates a lot of stress on the individuals. So it takes two to tango. And the third area I really wanted to point out as we have context, and this happened just a couple of weeks ago in a program where I had around 40 international professionals, and a gentleman from Nigeria raised his hand, and we were having this discussion. And he said, I'm going to share something with you. I feel somewhat offended that when I'm with other native speakers, I'm not even considered a native speaker of English. And so what really kind of occurred to me is that with conscious or unconscious, perhaps there's a little elitism at play there. And that perhaps, in the world I'm working in predominantly here in the United States, is that American English kind of now needs to also take a look at the rest of the world and recognize other native speakers as well. So let's take a look at some of these interlocking strategies as we move ahead. And you know what? It's sure enough, all of them are related, and I can present them in three categories. But in reality, as people interact on a daily basis, all of them are very fluid in nature and working, in and out of each other. So we tried to create a positive approach for this. Organizations can really look to uncover hidden assets. And part of that reason is, and as we have kind of talked about this in the background, that there's stress on the talent pipeline. And if there are hidden assets inside organizations, perhaps there's a couple of really important things that we need to do inside organizations. And I realize the DE&I community is taking the lead in all of these initiatives. So very exciting. So why are they hidden? And part of the reason is because of confidence. And the lack of confidence that many non-native speakers experience. And I will share with you that it's complicated. And the reason it's complicated is because oftentimes that confidence, that lack of confidence, is not seen. It's not observed. People are communicating in English, and I don't know. I no longer, I'll use an idiom, need to equal the playing field because you speak English well. And the reality is that in this journey that non-native speakers are experiencing, I'll give you some examples. My very close colleagues will share with me that as they're working in English as a non-native language, at the end of the day, they are totally exhausted. Totally exhausted. And it's just very challenging and very difficult. And perhaps people aren't seeing it. And then at the end of this week, at the end of this crazy day, I'm about to go into a meeting, and now it's now that the pandemic has hit, it's probably a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting. And I'm going to be with a group of native speakers of English. And boy, that conversation moves rapid fire. And it's going back and forth. And people are kind of interrupting each other to get some, information in. And lo and behold, the easiest thing for me to do as I am exhausted and trying my best to keep up in my English is to simply stay quiet. And that is a prevalent example that I think is happening across organizations. Also think of this, and I work with a lot of native speakers in presenting with impact. Think about doing it in another language. And think about the natural kind of hesitancy that one has about public speaking. And now compound that by doing it in another language. My goodness gracious. Another area that we see on a regular basis is, predominantly working in the United States, it's an extroverted society where talking makes a big difference. You need to be heard. You need to say a few things. And in these rapid fire conversations, how can I, what skills can I use to get my voice heard? We actually have something we call graceful interruption. And it's really one of the hardest things for non-native speakers to do. So we're uncovering hidden assets because there's a need to build confidence. And we'll talk more about what that means and how we can do that. But very interesting to me, the group that's hardly ever looked at in this process are the native speakers. And we really think that it's time to enhance the skills of native speakers to help them, yes, improve relationships, but also improve communication. And for Lead in English, we focus on communication. And, in a little bit, we'll talk about what it means as a kind of redefinition of clarity, and that the intended message should be the received message. And I'll give you one of those skills as an example so we can hang our hat on something. I came across an example. SHRM did a study a couple of years ago called The Silencing of Non-Native Speakers. And I prefer calling it hidden assets because I don't know that it's so, overt, that it's trying to keep people silent. But this example I came across because I had experience working with an aviation company many years ago, helping Russian pilots communicate well in English so they could understand the air traffic controllers who are native speakers. And here's an example that it wasn't coming from my program, but I saw this the other day. The air traffic controller said to the Russian pilot, "How's your ride going today?" And the Russian pilot went like this. And didn't come up with something. And so the air traffic controller simply said, "Okay, no problem, thanks. So let's," and then he went on to another area. Well, here's a skill right there, is that, and I'm not even sure that's a wild idiomatic expression, "How's your ride going?" But it wasn't understood whatsoever. And perhaps the skill is to not grade the language to treat people like they don't have the intelligence, but to actually use actual language that says something along the lines, "Are you experiencing air turbulence today?" That's a skill. So, part of what we're doing is really taking a look at the lead that DE&I is taking, and of course, working inside this world with Jorg, and for many years, our services have been brought in by DE&I. And it's important that the bias proofing efforts really are a part of the talent identification process. But before we go there, let's take a look at some of those biases and what they are. And the best way for me to kind of approach that is through what we call the accent trap. And with this took up a large portion of our book, Leading in English. And, I learned a lot from Jorg in this area, and then related it to the thousands of people that we've worked with over the years. And the best way I can do this is to give you a powerful example. A woman from China, working in a company as a senior manager, regularly on her performance reviews, high potential, needs help with communication skills, needs to improve her English. So we go through the traditional assessment, and I want to share with you, it happens on a regular basis. We have no problems understanding her accent. We'll talk more about what that means in a second. And she does, kind of have certain issues with dropping sounds at the ends of words, like dropping, if she wrote, as she writes it, she writes it perfectly, but, the work gets done instead of the work gets done. In her oral production, she drops the S. I'm kind of like, well, big deal. However, we interview stakeholders to find out how we can best do this coaching. And her boss's boss was one of the stakeholders. And what they said to me at the end of my conversation was, just go fix her. And I couldn't help myself. And to this day, I still kind of get annoyed when I share this story. And well, there's nothing broken. And at the end, really, the area was still, just go fix it. Take care of the problem. Really, bring it back so that there's no problem here. And I'm not sure that that's so prevalent inside organizations. That's not an unconscious bias. That's a conscious bias. I'll let you decide whether that's there. But the second conversation I had with her direct manager was revealing to me. And I went through, what does it mean? What does the accent trap mean? And really, that is a part of what people feel, that they're not prepared to do sophisticated work. They can't necessarily be trusted to get things done. Perhaps they lack a little bit of intelligence. And this whole idea, and we're very clear that, no two accents are alike. And perhaps people coming from the Asian countries are evaluated differently than people coming from the UK. And so when I said this to the manager, there was this very awkward pause. And really what the pause was, it took like 5 seconds. And in a conversation, that's a long time. And she stopped and she said, I do this all the time. I didn't even know it. I'm not even aware of it. And for me, that was really very, very revealing. So, in terms of what this means, is really that we have to be careful how we evaluate accents. I'm a firm believer that it's not how we sound. And so perhaps there's a redefinition of what we mean by clarity. And clarity no longer has to do with the way people sound. Clarity of expression, I think, is important, and articulation becomes very, very important. So that really needs to shift and change. And so that's, in essence, a lot of where the biases are taking place, right around that accent trap. There are others, and we can spend more time talking about those, elsewhere. But so innovative solutions, what exactly does that mean? And I'd really like to kind of share with you a little bit about what it means to kind of build confidence in this level. And, so first of all, let me talk to you a little bit about the population that we're predominantly working with when we say professionals. People coming out of the sciences, we work a lot with accountants, engineering, and all those different levels. We work a lot with chemists. And really, we have to sort of understand where they are in the language process as we talk about English. And really, first of all, in the classic scale of language, where if you go from 1 to 10, and I realize different systems here, but 1 being a beginner and 10 being bilingual, the people we're predominantly working with are in that 7 to 10 range, meaning that they have a wealth of experience working inside of English. And so standalone language programs are really not enough. And the standalone language, and by the way, sometimes the language programs are appropriate in certain areas, but not as the totality. So taking a scientist who has a fear of public speaking, and we've working recently with a Japanese scientist who really has a hard time standing up in front of groups, telling him to take conversational English doesn't really address the issue. So what is needed there is to understand that there's a universe of learning that goes on inside that fluency zone, and that no two individuals are actually alike. And so as we're building this confidence, we need to layer in the fact that interactions are not just about English, but there are cultural dynamics at play regularly, and that many of the folks we're looking at are in pursuit of leadership positions. So for me, that plays an enormous role in understanding what we mean by innovative solutions. So acknowledging that they are working in English every day and that they have gained a certain level of fluency becomes an important part of what we're looking at in terms of providing those solutions. I'll take a moment on the targeted feedback for a second, because a lot of the professionals that we're working with are told, slow down, articulate everything very clearly, and being understood is the most important thing that you need to worry about. And so, you know what? Not necessarily bad advice. There are some people who speak too quickly. There are some people we know they speak too quickly because they're intimidated by their language. And if I speak quickly enough, you're not going to really hear my grammatical mistakes. So let me go quick. Not bad advice. But let me ask you a question. Is really, when's the last time you saw a leader stand up in front of a group and speak so slowly that everyone will understand them? And so that leadership feedback becomes an essential part of the support system. And the recognition really of who these individuals are and where they're coming from become absolutely an essential part of the process. So that is one of the reasons, those are several reasons why confidence needs to be built across the board. So, as we're looking at international professionals and understanding their backgrounds and respecting the skills that they already have, what are some of those skills inside the fluency zone that we're talking about? Well, it usually centers around connection and engagement. And in that whole concept of outsider-insider, feeling like an outsider, one of the most difficult things that I can do is make connections with the inside group. And perhaps this is really not a bad time at all to take a look at where native speakers come in to play. We talked about the pilot example and using clear messaging without grading the English. And, in generations gone by, and my mother, God rest her soul, would always say something along the lines of, she would speak louder and slower. And so, I don't think we're seeing that as much, but the engagement becomes very, very difficult. And I would say the most important thing that we're really facing when we're working with native speakers is that they allow time for that connection and engagement. And if meetings that we talked about earlier, where there are rapid fire discussions, I would say, yes, the idea is to create an opening in that area for people to share. But I would also say it's a very nice thought that prior to the meeting to also indicate, during the meeting, I may call on you. And so that, you have an opportunity to kind of prepare a response. And that level of opening, I think, becomes extremely important part of the process. And then explaining, idioms and all the other areas of our language. I'll share a wonderful example with you. True story, very sophisticated leader of HR in front of a global team, working with folks coming from 13 different countries. And she herself, a native speaker of English, is an international professional. And as she was saying, she used the term, now, before we throw the baby out with the bathwater, and she kept going. And I want to share with you that there were at least 13 people in the room that leaned forward and went like this. What in the world does that mean? And I raised my hand and I said, could you explain that for a second? And she laughed at herself and she said, absolutely. That's an expression that simply means while we're, getting rid of ideas, let's make sure that we're not throwing out those things that are completely, useful for us in this conversation. So from that standpoint, I think it was really a learning point. And what I came away with, and this is what I'll share, I think you should avoid them in writing. And I think really taking a look at written documentation becomes absolutely essential. However, in speaking and in everyday conversations, just take the moment to kind of explain them and talk about them. And that creates that connection and engagement, because I promise you, that is the language that people want to learn. And it's not that and really we kind of go through this with our international professionals who want to become insiders. And we encourage them. And after 20 years of living in the United States, some people never get to that point. But perhaps the learning on both sides is to become a terrific outsider and really understand what it means to engage and connect with the inside group. I'll share with you a point that seems so minor that comes up on a regular basis, and that's small talk. And really, in the United States, people misunderstand small talk. And being a native speaker myself and coming from the United States, I find myself in a position regularly working with people and explaining the value of small talk, because the reputation around the world is that just talk about the weather and how's everything going. And there's kind of a superficial tendency in the United States not to, approach meaningful topics. And on top of that, when I'm talking about sports takes up such a huge role. When I'm talking about sports and I don't like sports and I don't want to like sports, the easiest thing for me to do is to back up and take a step back. Well, the way I explain small talk is that it creates bridges between people and connections. And that's often how we're using it in the United States. So later on, when we take on those large examples, those big, areas that we have to work with together, because we have a bridge created, it's easier to go back and forth. And so in terms of style shifting and style flexing, I think it's important for the native speaker, the non-native speakers, to take a step forward instead of a step back. And you know what I say? If you don't like sports or if you don't watch television shows, continue not to watch them and continue not to like sports. But the flex is to perhaps do a little homework and understand what teams are perhaps play in the cities that you live in, and take a step forward and say, you know, I really don't know a great deal about American football, but boy, that sounded interesting. Could you tell me more about that? And that perhaps goes back to, you know, working in an extroverted society. And one last example I'll use before we go to the kinds of questions. Working with an individual that came through one of our programs, and she actually wrote a paper called "An Introvert Living in an Extroverted Society" and what it means for her. And 3 years later, we have an annual program that we run. She came back as a guest speaker in that annual program, shared the report that she had written to the group of individuals who were about to relocate to the United States. And somebody raised her hand and said, so you're actually being heard at meetings, you're sharing things with ideas. So in a way, have you become more extroverted? And she said, absolutely not. I would prefer staying at home and reading a book rather than going out and doing any particular networking or actually making, you know, phone calls when I don't need to make phone calls. But it's a part of my flex of my style. So that kind of fuels our way into empathic listening and to care about those who are sitting in front of us. So there are skills that native speakers and non-native speakers together can work on to help this process. And the native speakers oftentimes are not included in this discussion. And it's something that we're trying to put at the forefront of organizations. I will now, Jorg, let me turn it over to you and see what kind of questions and comments that we have coming in.
Yeah, there were a whole host of questions, so I'll guide us through this. I think I'll take the last one that came in first, because it's actually, you know, a reflection on this very session. And by the way, I mean, I just resonate with this whole idea that we need to start talking about our experience with English in our, that alone will go a long way. But so here's the question. I speak English as a non-native speaker. This is great content, but what do you mean by graded English? So, going right back to your slide.
Yeah, sure. Graded English means to reduce the language to its simplistic form. So taking it down a grade. So thank you for asking that question. And meaning that, you know, the expression, one of the worst expressions in English is to dumb it down. And really, there's no place for that. And I don't think it's a matter of reducing the level of language, but it's actually using language that expresses a clarity of meaning. Here's the idea. In the classic communication format, you have a sender, you have a receiver. The message is sent, and there's all kinds of stuff in the middle. We all know that. We've all seen that. And then there's a received message. And the only thing that matters in that model is the message that's received. Mm-hmm. So our job, when I say avoid graded English, is not to reduce the level of our English, but it is to make sure that the intended message is actually the received message. And I hope that was helpful.
So here is another question that's related to your example. You know, the one with the flight, you know, the flight communication, and the question is simply, If you, I'd love for you to address training for native speakers in being more direct, and I think that's a really interesting question, right?
Really
Native
is.
speakers being more direct, such as the direct question you mentioned: are you experiencing turbulence? That's a much more direct way of stating
Yes.
it, and I hope I'm interpreting the question correctly. But you know because that's part of that training of native speakers. Right?
Yeah, great. Really, really interesting questions. And I think the most important thing is to understand that everyone has a slightly different communication style, and that all of us need to adjust to the different styles. Yes, we have direct communicators. And yes, the point to get from point A to point B is to draw a straight line and get there. And in fact, whenever we go through this process, the direct communicators say, okay, that's it. There's nothing left to talk about. You go from A to B and you get there. But there are also considerate communicators, empathic communicators, who love to take a loop back. And they're just as intelligent as direct communicators. And they get started on the path from A to B, but they take a loop back. By the way, how was your weekend? How did that whole thing work out for you? Oh, really? And maybe they'll filter in some indirect thing to just create a touch point with the communicator. In the meantime, the direct communicators are, come on, you can do this. You can get to point B. It's a different style. And recognition of that different styles, that's a leadership skill. There's another style, that perhaps my favorite might be, the spirited communicator. Those communicators, they know they got to get to point A to point B, but they want you to draw the conclusion themselves. So they share stories with you. They give you examples, and they're, being creative, and they want you to come up with the idea so that you have buy-in to it, and people, really, and by the way, as they're doing that, the direct communicators are like, come on, you can do this. You can get to point B. It's a different style. And then you're approached with systematic communicators who they themselves also know point A to point B, and you draw that straight line, but so many different lines go in between before you get to point A, point B, because all the details become so very important. So I think the question is magnificent because it points to flexing styles and understanding the nature of the different styles at play. Does that help in the communication process? You bet it really does. And so it's not just so much having Americans become more direct, and I know many cultures are dying for American people to be more direct, but I think the leadership skill behind that is recognition and style recognition.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Vince. There are a few other questions that are coming in, and that I'll combine one of them, or I'll combine two of them. So how, some practical advice for those who are perhaps naturally quiet, or I would add, because of the other question, culturally quiet, because, yes. I mean, you can be naturally or culturally quiet. And how does that actually also impact things like Zoom conferences or yes. So now I'm combining three questions, but I know we have limited time, so maybe that kind of belongs together.
In a conference the other day, a gentleman from Mexico raised his hand and said, when I first found out I was coming to the United States, I thought I had to become somebody totally different. I thought I needed to change who I am. So I think if you're naturally quiet, and by the way, not all introverts are naturally quiet. Those are perhaps mutually exclusive. I would say the most important thing you can do is stay naturally quiet and don't change that, and find out where your passion is. and make sure you find a way to communicate that passion in your quiet format, because passion is not delivered in one particular method. It's delivered in a variety of different ways. The most important thing that, coming into any culture is to remain authentic to yourself. Find your authentic English. And I'll give you a skill for anybody in a Zoom conference, because that was a part of the question, and that is graceful interruption. And first of all, you have to accept that you're going to be rude. And that's a hard thing to do, because it's just not easy to be rude, but in a graceful way. And so here's an example. Excuse me, I'm so sorry for interrupting you. But I think you made just an important point. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? Or better yet, when you don't understand something, oh, I'm sorry, let me stop you there for a second. Could you go over that again? I want to make sure I got that proper. I want to make sure I understood that properly. And so I think authenticity becomes absolutely essential, staying who you are and learning tactics to make sure your voice is heard. It doesn't have to be overheard. And you know what? It's your business acumen that will lend itself to whether you should be heard in a particular area, or maybe you should be quiet in that area too. One has to kind of understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Great. One more question, perhaps. Because it's related to what you called the fluency zone. And, the question is really, what skills, what does that mean? What skills are in there? I don't know if you can describe that briefly.
Yeah, I think inside the fluency zone, it's first of all, one of the things that almost all international professionals face. They say, I need to build a better vocabulary. We hear that almost unanimously. And the message I find myself consistently delivering is, well, then go get better at vocabulary, but understand the vocabulary you use right now is good enough. So stop with that. That would be one area of acceptance of vocabulary. Another, when I say there's a universe of learning, they're influencing skills. Influencing without authority. How do I create an engagement and a connection with somebody so that I have influence? And that starts to begin complicated learning around, and this is so hard to do, what's happening in the office I'm working in, what's happening in the work environment. Can I see beyond that? Do I understand the politics that goes beyond that? That's all a part of that learning. That's not just about conversational English and grammatical English and building your vocabulary. So when I say a universe of learning, there's, collaboration, influencing skills, negotiation skills. There's a lot of things that go on to make a complete communicator.
Yeah. This is there's a lot in here, right? A lot of learning, a lot of development that needs to happen. I particularly resonate with this whole notion of working at the organizational level, working at the individual level, including the native and non-native speaker, because we're all allies in making sure that communication works. And at the organization level, we are creating the container for those relationships and interactions, and making sure that in all these efforts to improve the container, we're not forgetting this particularly element in our environments, and that's people struggle with on a day-to-day basis is very important. So there is one question that came in. I'm going to not ask you to answer it, Vince, because it's a very hard question to answer, but it's something to ponder, and the question was simply, you talked about these different varieties of native English, that includes people from Nigeria or Jamaica or India, who all have distinctive accents, recognizable accents, but who speak English natively. And in making a distinction and an inference into those accents, is that a manifestation of racism? And given the quite the currency of the topic around race and racism in this world, this may be something that we all can think about a little bit. But I really want to thank you for guiding us into this topic. For everybody who's dialed in, thank you for joining us and joining this conversation. You can always reach out to us if you want more information, if you want to just engage in this topic. And I do need to say, because this was the first of a series of spotlight sessions, there are 12 in this season. So for the next 12 weeks, there will be these type of explorations of different topics that relate to inclusive leadership and inclusiveness more broadly. I do have to tell you, because this is the first one, and we've been working very hard in bringing this whole series to life, you have all received an email message during this session from our platform. Please ignore that. That was a technology glitch that happened. So please ignore that particular email. I apologize that went out. And you know, we all of this helps us learn not just the use of English, but also the use of technology as we are improving in this area. Thank you, Vince. Thank you to everyone who has dialed in. Thank you for a great team that brought brings these sessions to life. And I hope you'll join us on one of the following, you know, spotlight sessions, and that we'll hear from you in some other format. Thank you.